So, in order to talk about some age-related changes that happen to the immune system, it's first necessary to understand a little bit about how the human immune system works. And so, the human immune system is split into kind of two parts. There's an innate immunity and an adaptive or acquired immunity. And these two immune systems have to work in concert for humans to actually develop immunity against invaders, right? And so the innate immune system is made up of two different things. First, it's made up of physical barriers, such as skin and mucous membranes that actually physically separate the external environment from the internal environment of the body. There are also some chemicals, both in the form of kind of stomach acid, chemical secretions in your mouth and nose, as well as your eyes, and some different types of enzymes, such as those in your mouth, that can provide some kind of physical barrier and protect our bodies from invaders that are trying to come in these different ways, and actually kill some potential invaders in the mouth or in the mucus before they can enter our body, or in the stomach before they can really spread to the bloodstream. Additionally, there are some other components of this sort of innate immune system, including the inflammatory response, such as fevers, and responses of several different types of cells that are kind of non-specific. The adaptive immune system, on the other hand, is more specific, right? And so the adaptive immune system consists of what we tend to think of when we think of immunity. It has two sets of cells, T cells and B cells. The adaptive immunity requires antibody generation, and it's the part of the immunity that can generate a kind of memory response for protection against future infection with the same invader. And so the things that are sort of important to remember is that the innate immunity is non-specific, but it tends to act quickly, right? So as soon as your body senses something is wrong, there's a potential invader, the innate immunity kicks in, right? And this is a quick response, but it doesn't last very long. And one of the things that the innate immunity also serves to do is actually activate the kind of slower, more specific immunity, which is adaptive immunity. And adaptive immunity may take longer to mount a response, but that response lasts much longer. And in the case of memory cells, can actually last for years and years. And so I'm going to talk a bit more about each of these immune systems individually, the different parts of them, as well as how they're connected and how sort of a memory is generated in the immune system on the next couple slides. Right, and so as I said, the innate immune system is the first line of defense against an invader. And it's made up of physical barriers like the skin and the hair, as well as mucous membranes, as well as some important types of cells. And so any invaders that can make it past the physical barriers that the innate immune system puts in place are subject to the process of phagocytosis, or that sort of engulfing and then degradation by a cell, right? And so there are two types of cells that can actually do phagocytosis, or take in an invader and then break it down. One of those is the macrophage, and the other is a neutrophil. And so macrophages can actually come to the site where an invader has entered the body, and then in addition to taking in that invader and phagocytosing it and breaking it down, they also secrete little chemicals called cytokines and chemokines that serve to attract their other phagocytic counterpart, the neutrophils, to the same area. And these cytokines actually can also activate a type of cell called dendritic cells to present their antigens to T cells. And so they sort of bridge that gap between the innate immune system and the adaptive immune system, and we'll talk more about that later. And so the other type of phagocytic cell that's important to innate immunity is the neutrophils. Okay, and neutrophils are circulating within the blood, and so you can see them here inside this capillary. And that means they have to actually get to the invaded tissue in order to start phagocytosing or destroying invaders. Luckily, the macrophages are already kind of chilling in the tissue, as you can see here, waiting for an invader, and then they secrete cytokines and chemokines once they sense one to sort of attract them to that site. And once neutrophils sense these cytokines and chemokines, they actually migrate from the capillaries into the tissue that's being invaded by this, in this case, a particular bacteria. And so neutrophils respond to these inflammatory cues, or the cytokines and chemokines, and they migrate to the infected area by a process called chemotaxis. And so the higher the level of cytokine and chemokine that these macrophages are secreting, the more likely it is that neutrophils will be drawn towards it and move towards that site, where they can also take in pathogens and phagocytose them and destroy them. Right, and so kind of some distinctions between these two cells. They're both kind of there to perform a similar function of taking in invaders and breaking them down, chewing them up and eating them. But macrophages are already waiting in the tissues. Neutrophils actually have to migrate to the spot of infection. And neutrophils are sort of dependent on macrophages to do that. And so that's the innate immune system and some of the important cells involved in that. There are some kind of really important cells involved in the adaptive or acquired immune system as well. These cells are known as lymphocytes, and we tend to think of them as the T and B cells. And so there are two major populations, the T cells and the B cells, both of which are made in the bone marrow. And in terms of the T cells, they have a lot of different functions. They can become naive T cells, sort of have the ability to become any type of T cell. They're non-differentiated. They haven't chosen a job or a fate yet. And they can therefore become any type of T cell that they want. They can become a helper T cell, a natural killer cell, or a cytotoxic T cell, which are sometimes called killer Ts. And you can see here the functions of these particular types of T cells, right? And so helper T cells have a role in activating B cells, which we'll talk about in a minute. Cytotoxic T cells are actually cells that can recognize and then kill infected cells. And the other important type of lymphocyte or cell in the adaptive immune system are the naive B cells. Once again, naive just means that these B cells haven't chosen a fate yet. They're sort of immature. They can be whatever they want to be. They're made in the bone marrow, and they tend to circulate around in the lymphatic tissue of the body. And when they do become activated in response or mounting, when an immune response is mounted, they differentiate or they mature into a cell called a plasma cell, which has this main function, as you can see here, of secreting antibodies. And so I'm going to talk a bit more about how naive T cells and naive B cells are activated to be able to perform these different functions on the next slides. Right? There has to be sort of a link, right, that takes the immune response or takes the infection and actually triggers an adaptive immune response to be activated, right? There has to be some kind of sensor that can sense when there's an attack ongoing and have a way to kind of make the adaptive immune system respond. And the real bridge between an infection and an immune response are the antigen presenting cells, or the APCs. And there are two types of APCs that I'm going to discuss, the dendritic cells and macrophages. Right? And so what an antigen presenting cell really does is it takes in a pathogen, as you can see here, via phagocytosis, and it actually chews it up, and then it displays little pieces of that pathogen, now called an antigen, on the outside. So the pathogen is taken in, broken down, and then little pieces or antigens are displayed on the outside of this cell. In this case, this is a macrophage. right? And the same is true for a dendritic cell. The phagocytotic cell eats a bacteria or takes it in via phagocytosis, breaks it down, and then displays little pieces of that particular pathogen, which are called antigens, on the outside. And this antigen presentation, or this showing off of these little pieces of a broken down pathogen, are important because they then are presented to cells in the adaptive immune system called helper T cells. And those helper T cells become activated, and that's what actually pushes the cell to mount an immune response. And so you can see that activation happening here in this cartoon, right? And so we have antigens being presented by an APC, a T cell seeing those antigens, becoming activated itself, secreting specific molecules that activate B cells that can then secrete antibodies. And you can actually see it down here in this electron micrograph image. This is an antigen presenting cell that has taken in a pathogen and is now basically presenting it on this side to a T cell. And there's actually a physical interaction between these two cells, right? The antigen presenter and kind of the antigen seer, or the T cell. And then that T cell can fully activate the rest of the immune response. And so APCs, whether they're dendritic cells or macrophages, are essential for taking sort of that innate immunity and that sensing of the original pathogen and that non-specific response and making it specific by activating the adaptive or acquired immune system. And so APCs do promote several different things, right? So when this macrophage takes in a pathogen and is now displaying an antigen here, it can actually serve to activate a naive T cell to either become a helper T cell or to become a killer T cell. And if the naive T cell becomes a helper T cell, what it does is it actually secretes small molecules that activate B cells to produce antibodies. And so the help that a helper T cell provides is to basically take this signal from an antigen presenting cell and activate B cells and antibody production as a result. If the naive T cell decides to become a cytotoxic T cell or a killer T cell, its function now becomes finding, invading cells, and destroying them. And APCs can also activate naive B cells to become plasma cells, right? And so you can see this antigen presenting cell here interacting with a B cell, promoting that B cell to become a plasma cell or to become activated. And the function of plasma cells is to make antibodies specific to that antigen that macrophage was presenting. And those antigens circulate within the bloodstream, and the next time an antigen is encountered, those antibodies can recognize it, bind it, and mount an immune response quicker. And so it takes several days for the body to make enough T and B cells to actually call it an immune response and respond to an antigen the first time it's encountered. So the innate immune system acts quickly, and then that response dies down, while the adaptive immune system makes enough T and B cells as well as antibodies to respond to the antigen. And then after that particular threat has been eliminated, most of the T and B cells that were made to mount this immune response are then destroyed via apoptosis. When the threat is gone, there's no need for these T and B cells to be there anymore, right? And so they undergo cell death. There are, however, a few T and B cells that remain as memory cells of that particular invader. And these memory T and B cells contain surface receptors that can recognize the same antigen that was presented to them the first time, so that next time those cells encounter that same antigen, a response can be mounted even quicker. And that's sort of the idea behind this adaptive or this acquired immunity, as well as the idea behind vaccination, right? And sort of creating a memory of a disease so that you can fight it faster the next time.